Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome, my dear faves, to the fifth part of What If Female Naruto Was the Older Sister to the Elric Brothers? Credit goes to Blood Pokemon 101 for this fantastic fanfic. Link is in the description for those who prefer to read or want to contact the author. Chapter 13. Departure of Lost Grievances. I'm leaving. Naruto suddenly announced after much hesitation. Her heart was thumping wildly against her chest as she waited anxiously for the ensuing yelling to come. She forbearingly awaited in anticipation, watching her brother's reactions with saddened eyes, carefully observing every expression and body language they made. Predictably, Edward went through a series of emotion. First confusion, wondering if he heard her right, then his golden eyes widened with shocked revelation as if he can't believe this was happening again, and finally they narrowed with burning rage and fury, his bangs shadowing his eyes. "Why you're leaving?" Alphonse croaked. Hearing the disbelief and sorrow in his voice made the blonde woman's heart hammer with guilt. "Yeah," Naruto replied, regretfully. "I have to go back to work," she quickly said, making up a believable story that isn't exactly the entire truth. "You're going back to work?" Al questioned, confused. "I didn't know you had a job, sister." "Yeah," she smiled, cheekily, sheepishly scratching the back her head. "They just messaged me, telling me to come back." "Don't worry, I'll come back soon," she quickly reassured her disheartened youngest brother. Al seemed to perk up, feeling hopeful. "Really? How soon?" Quote. The blonde kunoichi swallowed a thick lump in her throat. Making out the faithful optimism in Al's hollowed tone caused her to become even more disconsolate at the fact that she'd be crushing his hopes in seconds. "Well, Al, it'll be soon," she answered, hesitantly, not knowing how else to respond. "Oh." The giant suit of armor let out a deflated breath of disappointment, sadness engulfing his entire being. "Don't be sad, Al," Naruto swiftly remarked. "I'll be back as soon as I can. I promise." Quote. "You promise?" Quote. Naruto's saddened eyes shifted towards Edward, getting ready to hear his belated angry response to her sudden departure. Finally, Ed lifted his head, glaring at his older sister with such intense, rage-filled, hateful eyes it made the uncomfortable and agonizing knot in her stomach twist. "You promise?" Exclamation mark. "That's always the same bullshit you give us every damn time," Edward screeched. He wasn't just angry. He was absolutely livid. Wrathfully incensed. "So what?" Exclamation mark. "We wait another fucking 10 years for you to come back?" Exclamation mark. Quote. "Ed, that's not. You didn't even come to Mom's funeral. Was it because of your job that you didn't come?" he accused with much detest in his voice. Naruto remained uncharacteristically silent. Ed's angry resentment and bitter and intense accusation hitting her like a sharpened knife to the heart. "You don't care about us. You don't give a damn," he screamed out. After he was indignant ranting, he panted, heavily, completely breathless from all the yelling. His voice was probably heard throughout the hall despite the door being closed. A sudden awkward and tense silence ensued. Alphonse glanced between his pissed-off brother and strangely quiet sister, fretfully, extremely agitated and worried that this physical. He was stuck in the middle, wondering who to side with if it came to that. At last, Naruko opened her mouth, but her words were anything but reassuring. "Ed, I know it's hard for you not to have your older sister around during times of hardships, but I do care about you and Al," she declared, wholeheartedly. "You boys are the most important people in the world to me. It's just, please understand that my work is very difficult," she explained, trying to find the correct word to describe her life as a shinobi without giving away any information at all. "I truly, sincerely do wish we could spend more time together, but with the distance between my work and here, it's just nearly impossible at times. But I really do try to visit when I can. And I have other people who need me. I can't just abandon them." Quote. Edward snorted, not seeming convinced. Naruko pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling a headache coming on. She knew Ed's hostility and icy resentment was her fault for keeping the truth from them. And she feared that Ed would never forgive her now, even she did come back weeks or months later. The blonde woman laid out her options, which wasn't much. The back of her neck dripped with anticipation. Should she really tell the truth? Would they even believe? Time to find out by ripping the band-aid off. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath to calm her nervous. Her palms were oozing with sweat, making them clammy. "Fine. I'll tell you the truth." Edward and Alphonse perked up tremendously at this, both looking at their older sister, expectantly, waiting with much trepidation to finally hear the truth from her, the reason she's been gone so long. Naruko opened her eyes, her cerulean blue orbs slightly stunning them a bit by the seriousness and weariness, as if she was tired from a long-fought battle. She paused, eyeing her brothers, wary of their response and almost anticipating it when she blurts out the next 5 words out her mouth that would sound insane in any sane person's ears. "I have defeated a god," she proclaimed, truthfully, not even a hint of exasperation in her voice. She waited, silently, letting her younger brothers sink her words like water flushing down a drain. She was calm and composed, her frantic rapid heartbeats toning down to a soft and quiet pulse. The female kunoichi deliberately picked out the one truth from her tale that would sound the most absurd out of all them, trying to gauge how they would react to such a far-fetched sounding story. There it is. That painful expression of disbelief and doubtful disappointment was all she needed. She let out a wide smile. She finally found her answer. At long last, this was it. For the first time in a while, she felt like she was finally free, like a weight was lifted off her shoulders. She was a bird gracefully soaring through the sky. She shouldn't tell them the truth, after all. All the constant agonizing she spent years fruitlessly debated over had decisively been answered. Was it wrong of her to feel so ecstatic about it? To not be wallowing in misery at being looked at as if she was a delusional psycho? Naruko pulled both her brothers into a tender hug. "Thank you," she whispered, softly. She could feel their bodies stiffen in plain confusion. She felt Al throw a hesitant arm around her while Ed just stood there, unsure how to feel. She quietly pulled away. With one last, fleeting smile, she turned and opened the door, letting them back inside. "I know it's late, but what do you guys want for dinner?" Quote. The next early morning, Naruko left without even a word of goodbye. Sasuke was the only one who saw her off. "Make sure to pass your state alchemist exam, Sasuke. It should be no problem." Naruko told him, confidently, fist pumped. Sasuke rolled his eyes, smirking, playfully, letting out a "HN." She nodded her head, accepting his response. "Oh, and make sure to take care of my little brothers." That statement made him frown. He overheard the entire conversation last night. How could he not, with all the yelling and screaming? And he knew that Naruko was hurting by the end of it. It was painfully obvious. Her heart was bleeding. "You made the right choice," Sasuke said, tightly jaw clenched, hands fisted. "Huh?" Naruko blinked in confusion. "Not telling them." Before she could ask to elaborate, the train was already moving, and then she was gone. The dark-haired Uchiha was in an incredibly foul mood. Just seeing Naruko's puzzled, distraught, lonely, and heartbroken expression was enough to make him go into a frenzy. After finding out she had adopted younger brothers, he had always wondered why Naruko always looked so lonely, despite having a living, non-blood related family. And now, he got his answers last night. A family that doesn't even try to understand is no different than having no family at all. And he guessed discovering she was Kurama's Jinchuriki made Naruko feel even more alone and isolated. He had swore to himself that he would do whatever it is in his power to make her happy. After all the misery and torment the lone Uchiha caused the extremely forgiving Uzumaki, happiness was the absolute one thing she deserved. Killing the pint-sized bastard was out of the question. And Sasuke seriously did contemplate killing Edward last night, or, at least, leaving him broken and mangled, unable to move his body for months. But he knew he couldn't do that, it would just make Naruko sadder. He complains about his suffering? Exclamation mark. Whatever problems him and his brother have would go away someday, it would eventually turn into nothing more than an awful dream. But his sister's problems would never go away. The little brat acts all arrogant and self-righteous, behaving like he's the one with all the problems. He didn't even try, no, he was blatantly unwilling to understand his sister's pain. And Naruko knew this. She knew he wouldn't. She knew he would be offensively unreasonable. In fact, she gave him a trial run last night, to put her expectations to the test, and Ed ultimately failed miserably. If Ed's goal in his complaints was to prove that was selfishly right about Naruko keeping her family in the dark, then, good job. He succeeded. Naruko's never going to tell him now. Sasuke breathed out a frustrated sigh. He really didn't want to see the stupid brat right now. He'd watch over him from a distance, but that's only because Naruko asked him to. He would gladly just spend his days training alone in preparations for the state alchemist exam. Naruko absolutely dreaded the upcoming meeting. However, she knew that it was something she couldn't just ignore. Not unless she wanted Konoha to be affected negatively. She promised when she returns back to Amestris, and hopefully, yet tragically for the final time, she would try harder to earn her brother's forgiveness. Or, at the very least, destroy all the homunculi, so they could live a safe, happy, normal life. Maybe she should bring some souvenirs on the way back. She just hoped she could get through this headache of a meeting and return as quickly as possible. She didn't feel at ease knowing that her younger brothers were in potential danger while she was away. Alphonse watched with anxious concern as Edward angrily paced around the living room, a prominent scowl on his face as he made himself, which included a simple plate of bacon and eggs. "I'm sure sister would be back, brother. She came back last time just like she promised," Al uttered, trying fruitlessly to lift his brother's foul mood. However, it only caused Ed to furiously slam the fridge so hard after retrieving a glass of juice that it shook a bit. Al just sighed, dejectedly. It was best not to speak about Naruto while he was this absurdly pissed off. Best to let him cool off a bit. He had to wonder, where did Sasuke run off to? He hasn't seen him all morning, he just hoped the guy was okay. It's been about a whole week since Naruto left, and Sasuke was finally getting ready for his exam. He silently made his way through the halls of the military, ignoring the whispers he was receiving from officers as he held up a paper detailing the information about the exam and what room the first one would be in. He paid no to their ignorant and needlessly incessant and pitiful whispers and comments about him trying to join the military at a ridiculously young age, just barely being an adult. Are you one of the new candidates here to take the state alchemist exam? Quote. Sasuke tilted his head to be greeted with a dark-haired man in his mid to late 20s with a blonde-haired woman with her hair clipped back and approximately about the same age, standing dutifully behind him. The raven-haired Uchiha took a moment to regard the man's question before simply nodded his head. This caused the military man to smirk in amusement. Not much of a talker, are we? Quote. Sasuke simply stared at the man, blankly. He was in no mood for jokes. Learning that the younger man was in no mood for small talks, the dark-haired man embarrassingly coughed into his hand. I'm Colonel Roy Mustang, he introduced himself in a serious and authoritative tone. He pointed a thumb at the woman behind him. And this is First Lieutenant Riza Hawkeye. Sasuke Uchiha, the young man tactfully and shortly uttered out his own name in compensation of the man, now identified as Roy Mustang, giving off his own name. Mustang just stared at Sasuke, wondering what was going on behind the younger man's head. His silence was a bit unnerving. It was as if he was looking at his very soul, studying him like an interesting tool. Right. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head. Well, anyway, to cut to the chase, if you do end passing the exams, you would be put under my jurisdiction, Sasuke, meaning you would become one of my subordinates. The Führer had told me that himself. Of course he did, Sasuke thought, ruefully. He met the so-called leader of Amestris just the other day. And, let's just say, how underwhelming it was to easily manipulate the man with a basic Sharingan genjutsu. Sticking as close to Naruto's brothers as possible was the plan, seeing as they are the heart of this whole conspiracy. Their sacrifices, as Sasuke remembered Naruto viciously telling him the homunculi describing her darling, little brothers as such. I just want to say, good luck on the exams, and I look forward to serving you. He saluted the aloof man, which Sasuke promptly saluted back before being on his way. Once Sasuke was out of earshot, Mustang lifted his gaze towards Hawkeye. Lieutenant, what do you think of that man? Quote. Well, he is certainly quiet and reserved, Hawkeye answered, observantly. The dark-haired man put his thumb to his lips, contemplate expression on his face. And that's what worries me. Types like that are really hard to discern. Sasuke had just completed the fairly easily written test the other day, thanks to his Sharingan, helping memorize every topic on alchemy he could his hands on in the library. Now, here he was at his second test, which consisted of sitting in a chair. He had heard that this was supposed to be the interview part of the test. But he already knew the true purpose of this test. To see if he was mentally stable, wanting to know and be assured that he wouldn't turn rogue and betray the Amestrian military at the drop of a hat, which he would eventually, because all this was just part of the plan to get closer to the homunculi. However, they don't need to know that. They would just get in the way. Although, just in case, his eyes bled crimson red upon activating his Sharingan. There were a few gasps of horror and surprise before the examiners fell victim to his genjutsu, their eyes turning ghostly paler than usual, almost blank. "Why do you want to join the military?" one of the examiners asked, blankly. Sasuke's was set in a grim line, his face devoid of any emotion as his Sharingan coldly stared into their genjutsu-induced eyes. The only emotion produced by him was the fierce determination behind his red eye. To protect someone dear to me, no matter what the cost. Chapter 14. Sibling separation. The room was tense. Silence. "What do you mean she left?" Exclamation mark. Winry shouted, appalled. The air was thick with dread and unease. An aura of sorrowful depression exuded from Alphonse. Edward, on the other hand, was scowling, deeply with barely controlled cold fury and fierce rage. "TCH, Ed grumbled. It's as we explained it. She left." Again, he growled out in emphasizing, showcasing resentment and bitterness he was feeling inside by his older sister's departure. "Well, why didn't you guys try to stop her?" she asked, curiously, a hint of sadness in her tone. "Why should we?" the blonde alchemist shouted, harshly, throwing his legs off the couch. "She left. Just like she did 10 years ago." He scoffed, spitefully. "Guess, her job is more important than us." "Brother." Al sighed, but there was no bite to his voice, just dejection. Taking in a frustrated breath, Ed let out an aggravated sigh. "You know, Al, I was really beginning to think that maybe Naruto wasn't at all that bad. It felt refreshing having our broken family amended. But now," he growled. "But now, I don't know. On one hand, I hate her. I hate her so much for abandoning us." His lips curved into a contemplative, bittersweet, thin line. "However, these past few weeks with Naruto were nice. They reminded me of the kind and caring big sister she always used to be when we were kids. Isn't that dumb? I want to hate her. I still do. Though, truthfully, I just can't." He gripped his hair in frustration. "Although, if there's one thing I find so utterly annoying, is that she still treats us as little kids." He shot a look towards his younger brother. "Come on, Al. You can't tell me you aren't a little mad at Naruto for treating us like naive, little boys who doesn't understand the world around them." Quote. Alphonse breathed out his own saddened hum. "Well, brother, honestly, I don't disagree with you. I just wish we knew where sister was," he said, dejectedly. There was a whisper of reserved silence that formed between them. "If that's how you guys feel, then why don't you ask Sasuke where your sister went?" Winry suggested. "I'm sure he knows." Both Ed and Al shot each other a look of determination and understanding. Winry was right. They should ask Sasuke where Naruto is, and chase her down instead of wallowing in self. It's about she told them what the hell is going on. Sasuke was busy practicing his shuriken jutsu, remembering Naruto given him strict instructions to keep his talents and abilities hidden. It was a good idea to practice his lightning jutsu though, to figure out a way to impress the judges. From what he recalled from the record books, only 1 or 2 people pass the exams each year, and he couldn't afford to fail. It's not that he wasn't confident in his abilities, far from it. He could only hope that no one else knew lightning alchemy. Or else he would have to come up with a flashy technique. He only a few hours before his third and final exam. Sasuke was in the air after a graceful leap, sporting several kunai in hand. With a flick of the wrist, the kunais shot towards their target with deadly accuracy, bouncing off each other with uncanny precision. A chidori formed in his hand, and he used his chakra to turn it into a blade, zipping it through the wooden pole he was using as target practice and splitting it in half. Mr. Sasuke. Quote. The raven-haired man casually tilted his head to the source of the person who called his name. Ed and Al finally found Sasuke at one of the courtyards that alchemists were allowed to use to train their alchemy for the upcoming exam. They spent hours searching for him everywhere they could think of. Although, he was nowhere to be seen until they finally got a tip from one of the military officers that Sasuke was in one of the training courtyards. They spotted the raven, calling out her name, and came rushing in his direction with one goal in mind: to find Naruto. Well, that was the plan. Until they witnessed Sasuke produce some sort of beam or blade of lightning in his hand. They couldn't help but to stare in absolute awe. So, this was Sasuke's lightning alchemy? They have never seen lightning alchemy, and that were completely enthralled. They were even more amazed when Sasuke twisted his wrist and the lightning produced several spears that pierced through the other practiced dummies. Okay. It was official. Ed and Al mesmerized and awestruck by the display of power and control. Lightning alchemy was such a rare ability. As it should be. Not only was it highly difficult and required extensive knowledge, it was also lethally dangerous. One fatal mistake and the alchemist could end up killing themselves or the people around them. To see Sasuke using it, and with such skill and grace, it was truly stunning. What is it? Sasuke's voice snapped the Elric brothers from their dazed fascination. His chidori disintegrated. He guarded both of them with a cool gaze. There must have some reason you came looking for me. So, what do you want? Quote. Edward shook his head, composing himself. A fierce, determined gleam shone in his golden orbs. Sasuke? You know where Naruto is, right? Tell us. Where is she? He demanded. Sasuke merely shot Naruto's younger brother a look of indifference. Why do you need to know? Was the Uchiha's cool reply. So, I can punch her face in when I find her. Ed declared, hotly. The raven-haired man raised an amused eyebrow. Even though they weren't exactly blood-related siblings, Edward was shared similar traits with Naruto. He was hot-headed and brash just like her. And almost just as stubborn. Brother. Alphonse chastised his older brother. He gave Sasuke an apologetic bow. Mr. Sasuke, forgive my brother for his rudeness. But if you know where our sister is, could you please tell us? He asked in a firm and resolute tone. Sasuke carefully regarded the determined look and slightly dejected aura coming from the brothers. Why? He questioned, simply. Why do you want to know? Quote. Because we are tired of her leaving us in the dark. Ed growled, angrily, clenching his fist into a tight ball. She never tells us anything. Sasuke could feel the anger and frustration radiating off him in waves. Sasuke knew where the two boys were coming from. The desperate need to be acknowledged by their older sister was all but there, despite them not saying anything. It's reflected deeply in their emotions and expressions. However, he also understood Naruto's side. Naruto was a world-famous kunoichi. The heroine of the Fourth Great Ninja War. Just because the war was over, doesn't mean there aren't enemies still lurking in the shadows. Enemies ready to take her on just to prove they could beat the great hero that saved the ninja world. And if they found out she has brothers, they would most definitely use them as hostages against her. The Akatsuki absolutely would have, and they would mercilessly kill Ed and Al once their purpose was done. As much as they loathed being left in the dark, it was for their own protection. Although, this wasn't his affair to deal with. The three blonde siblings needed to sort out their own problems themselves. The only thing the Raven could offer was some frank and wise advice. Have you ever thought about why your sister keeps you in the dark? He asked, rhetorically. I don't care. Ed yelled. That's not for her to decide. We aren't children. Quote. Al placed a placating hand on his brother's shoulder to keep him from getting too riled up. He gazed up at the Uchiha with pleading, glowing, red eyes. Please, Mr. Sasuke. We just want to be with our sister. I understand what you are saying. But my brother and I don't want to be left in the dark anymore. He declared with just as much passion and determination as Ed. His metal fist shook at his side as Sasuke was giving him an unreadable expression. We aren't babies. We can take care of ourselves. What's so important that she can't tell us? Doesn't she know how lonely we get without her? Doesn't she? Doesn't sister trust us? Quote. Edward stared at his baby brother in surprise. He didn't know Al had this much frustration boiled up inside him. This was the first time Al had expressed such displeasure, such indignation, such pain and anguish over Naruko's absence. Ed never knew his brother had this much vexation and sorrow bottled up inside. Eventually, he smirked proudly before piercing the dark-haired man with a hard glare. He was not backing down from. Sasuke, however, was watching both boys with a guarded expression. They weren't backing away from this decision, were they? He could see their determination and resolve emitting from them similarly to the force of a firecracker. If I told you, are you sure you won't regret it? He asked them, coolly. He had to know. He had to test them one more time. He had absolutely sure they were prepared for even the consequences. That they weren't simply requesting Naruko's whereabouts out of a mere whim or some sort of self-satisfaction. He just wanted to test how strong their conviction is. And maybe it was his own past that caused him to sympathize with the brothers' plight. In all honesty, he didn't want Ed and Al making the same mistake he did. Hating and loathing their older sibling, not realizing the pain the other side is going through whilst being hated by someone they cared so much about and sworn to protect, no matter what, even at the cost of themselves. After all, it was the duty of an older sibling to protect their younger brothers and sisters. That's why Naruko never thought about bringing them to Konoha. She didn't want Ed and Al to go through the same pain, sadness, and loneliness as she did. Because if she would have taken them, they would surely be picked upon and ostracized for being related to a Jinchuriki. Being hated, despised, and looked down upon for something they had no control over nor understand. Inwardly, he frowned just thinking about it. Naruko was always self-sacrificing like that. Maybe secretly knowing she had a family, people who loved her is what helped her push through the harsh and dark times of her childhood and persevere. He was too late to see past Itachi's facade and witness the agony his brother was going through. He doesn't want Naruko experience what Itachi went through. Truthfully, he was doing this for her benefit than the brothers. Naruto couldn't run away from this forever. We want to know. Where is our sister? They both yelled, simultaneously, becoming increasingly fed up with the repeated questioning. If Sasuke knows where their sister, why doesn't he tell them already? Instead of wasting their time asking them these testy inquiries? Does he believe they are not serious? Sasuke just stared at the brothers, wordlessly. His expression portrayed nothing. You know, you two are almost as much of a loser as your sister, he finally spoke with a hint of amusement. What? Ed and Al were slightly baffled by the comment, wondering if they heard the older boy right. Nothing. He closed his eyes, contemplative. Naruto was probably going to kill him for this. He could already imagine her barreling after him with the force of a Susanoo. He promised he won't tell them she was a shinobi, but she never said anything about informing them of her current location. Although, the blonde alchemist was having none of that. His temper flared. No. Did you just call us losers? What do you mean? He shouted, angrily. Sasuke smirked. It means you're just as stubborn as Naruto. What? Exclamation mark. An angry fist rose. Al had to hold his irate brother back from striking the Uchiha. If you want to know Naruto is, Sasuke started, his voice causing the brothers to listen to him, intently. If you want to know your older sister's location, meet me on the roof tonight. He twisted his body around until his back was facing them. He began walking away. Wait! Edward shouted after him, making him halt in his tracks. Why can't you tell us now? Quote. I've got things to do, the raven-haired man responded, casually. My test is starting soon. Don't have time to explain. Plus, he didn't want any prying eyes or eavesdroppers listening in on their conversation. Not to mention, he could sense a dark, inhuman presence from just around the corner. He marched onward towards the command center where his finally test was taking place. He threw a dark glare at the spy who was hiding behind the bush. He heard a faint gasp coming from that area and a near-silent rustle that soon followed. The spy must have caught on that he was spotted and fled. The Uchiha merely scoffed and continued on his way. Edward and Alphonse just stared, slightly perplexed as Sasuke walked away, witnessing his form disappearing further and further away. Ed grumbled, crossing his arms. I really don't get that guy. Naruto was right. He can be a bit of a bastard. Though the colonel is much worse. Well, at least, Mr. Sasuke agreed to let us know where sister is, so we can find her, Al inputted, positively, feeling grateful towards the guy who barely knew them, but still decided to help them with their family predicament. We should be thankful he's even telling us. Sister rarely tells us anything. The elder Elric breathed out a reluctant sigh. I guess you're right, Al. He looked out into the distance before gazing back his armored baby brother. Sasuke just stared at the examinees and spectators with same aloof expression on his face. There were two things he noticed. One, the Führer wasn't in the audience. However, two, his soon-to-be superior officer and his lieutenant were. He tried to get a feel of everyone's chakra, determining who was the biggest threat in the room, in case he was caught. Nobody in the room had any decent amount of chakra. All of their chakra reserves were equivalent to that of mere civilians. If things get hairy, he could easily put all of them into a genjutsu with his Sharingan. One of the officers approached him. Do you need something to draw transmutation circles with? Quote. No need, Sasuke coolly dismissed him. The man looked uncertain, but backed away, nonetheless. There were already mutters and whispers going around the room. Is he just like that Full Metal kid? Quote. Can he perform without a circle? Quote. They tried to keep their voices quiet and low, but Sasuke could hear them perfectly with his chakra-enhanced hearing. He could clearly hear the various emotions in their tone. Some showed awe and admiration. Others displayed absolute disdain, obviously displeased at the prospect of having someone stronger than them. While a few were merely indifferent, only here to watch and observe, to see what happens. Not paying them any more mind, the dark-haired man produced a stream of lightning. It was crackling over his hand. Little linings of electricity encasing his hand like a makeshift shield. It was simply a week of his Chidori. Nevertheless, that didn't stop the cries of awe and squawks of disbelief from erupting around the room. See? He's just like the kid from 3 years ago. Quote. He can do alchemy without a transmutation circle, too. Quote. Not only that, but he could use lightning alchemy. You know how rare that is? Exclamation mark. Quote. Sasuke stopped himself from rolling his eyes in exasperation. Unbelieving. These people sounded worse than his fangirls back in his academy days. With their wide-eyed astonishment and jaws dropping like flies, their expressions completely gobsmacked. And here he thought he had to show off more of his skills. Guess not. If they were this awestruck and flabbergasted at a simple, bastardized version of a jutsu, they were seriously out of touch with the shinobi world. Without a word, the Uchiha shut off his Chidori. There was no use showing off his Chidori Senbon or Chidori Sharp Spear. There was no need, and it served to his advantage. At least, he wouldn't have to show off more of his skills and techniques to any potential enemies they may lurking in the room, observing his final test. He still waited patiently as the judges talked among themselves in harsh whispers. They tried to remain stoic and unfazed, but they were doing a pretty poor job of it. He could see the beads of sweat pouring down one man's face. One man couldn't wipe that imperious smirk from his face, so he tried hiding it behind his man. The last one looked pretty fearful. No doubt wondering if they let Sasuke, would he one day usurp him? Finally, the one with the leering gleam in his, viewing Sasuke as no more than a potentially powerful weapon joining the ranks, stood up. Looks like we know who's going to be this year's new state alchemist. He proclaimed, clapping his hands, joyously. Though the haughtiness in his voice was easily detectable. Sasuke merely let out a "HN," taking it as his cue to leave. As promised, Sasuke met Edward and Alphonse on the roof of the hotel later that night. When she was informed by the brothers of their plans to see their older sister, Winry decided to join in, too. You promised you would tell us where Naruto is, Edward demanded, impatiently, arms crossed. Well? Out with it. Quote. Sasuke merely quirked an eyebrow. This was Naruto's brother. He obviously lacked any kind of patience. Or respect for that matter. Brother. Don't be rude. Alphonse chastised him. He gazed at the dark-haired Uchiha with an apologetic look. I'm sorry about my brother's rudeness, Mr. Sasuke. But you did promise us you would tell us. There was a curve in Sasuke's lips, possibly from amusement, but it quickly dissipated. First off, I didn't promise you anything," he spoke out, promptly. As soon as that sentence uttered from his mouth, Edward immediately turned red with anger. Though, the Uchiha continued on before he could lash out. "However, if you want to catch up to Naruto, take a train ride to a town called Nikiyomi," Sasuke continued to explain. "From there, you would find a ship heading towards the Elemental Nations." "Elemental Nations?" Al inquired, confused. The same puzzled expression was on Ed's and Winry's faces. "What's the Elemental Nations?" Winry asked. "It's a continent out in the far east. It's also Naruto's birthplace." There was stunned gasps that erupted from the three of them. Sasuke guessed Naruto never got around to telling them where she was born. Perhaps vague hints, but nothing specific. Man, how much was she keeping from them? He would have thought she would, at least, told them that much. He merely shook his head as he resumed explaining. "There you would land on the outskirts of the Land of Lightning. Head to the Land of Fire. That's where your sister is." The brothers nodded, firmly in confirmation, signaling to Sasuke that they understood all that. "Is there a specific town she's staying?" Winry questioned, trying to garner more information from the young man. Sasuke merely told her no. Naruto is traveling now, so she doesn't have an exact location. Plus, it would be less suspicious on his part if he left her current location vague. He wasn't supposed to be telling them this much anyway. "Thanks, mister." Sasuke, Al spoke with much gratitude in his tone. Edward smirked, slamming his flesh hand into the open palm of his metal one. "Let's go buy a train ticket to Nikiyomi that leaves first thing in the morning, Al," he declared with fierce determination. "I'm going with you guys," Winry proclaimed. "Actually, it would be best if you stayed here, Winry." Sasuke denied her request, causing her to shoot him a saddened and incredulous look. "What? Why?" Quote, "The Elemental Nations is no place for civilians," was the Uchiha's reply. He wasn't being rude. Just blunt. At least, it was no place for civilians without any knowledge about shinobi nor any self-defense skills as far as he could tell. "I'm only telling Ed and Al this because if worse came to worst, they could defend themselves with their alchemy. However, I don't advise you on the matter." He gave the brothers a hardened look. "Don't show off. Keep yourselves hidden. Don't reveal your identity to anyone." Now, it was Ed's turn to shoot Sasuke a look of disbelief and suspicion. "Why?" Quote, "The Uchiha wanted to open his mouth to say that if the wrong people found out about the brothers' relationship to Naruto, they would surely try to use it to their advantage. He would do whatever it was necessary to protect Naruto. He will make sure she lives long enough to become Hokage and change the ninja world." Though, none of the words of conviction were uttered from the raven-haired man's mouth. Instead, he said with his voice cold and serious, "Because if you don't, you will surely get yourself killed." Chapter 15. A Mother's Plight. "You guys are really going to see Naruto, huh?" Winry inquired, feeling happy for the brothers. "Of course," Edward proclaimed, loudly. "After so many years, we finally get a solid clue about Naruto's whereabouts. And it's a good one." He continued to pack his supplies in his suitcase for his trip across the ocean, apparently. "Their train leaves in an hour. I'm so excited, brother." Al voiced, the enthusiasm in his tone clearly noticeable. "We're going overseas." We've never been to the ocean before." Quote. Winry could feel the armored boy's excitement and smiled. "Don't forget to bring me a souvenir," she requested, giving Ed an expectant gaze. The blonde alchemist lazily waved his hand, closing suitcase since he was finished packing, which wasn't much. Yeah. I'll bring you a fancy wrench, gearhead." An angry tick mark formed on the mechanic's forehead. "What did you say, pipsqueak alchemist?" Exclamation mark. She yelled, furiously. Ed's own temper flared when she insulted him calling him a pipsqueak. His trigger word. "What did you call me?" Exclamation mark. He yelled, enraged. The only female in the room just ignored him. She sighed. "Al, make sure to keep your brother in line." Knowing Ed, I'm sure he's going to cause trouble the minute he steps off the ship. "Hey. I don't cause trouble." Quote. "Don't worry, Winry," Al said, reassuringly. "I'll make sure brother stays out of trouble." "Al. Whose side are you on?" Exclamation mark. "Why is everybody ganging up on me?" Exclamation mark. Quote. The sizzling sound of a whistle blew, signaling the train's soon-to-be departure. "You two take care and stay out of trouble, all right?" Winry said with a bit of humor and concern. Edward rolled his eyes in exasperation. "Quit worrying. We'll be fine." "I can't help but to worry, okay?" That confession caught both brothers slightly by surprise. The blonde mechanic gave her childhood friends a look that was a mixture of fear, unease, and anxiety. "Since last night, I've been thinking about Sasuke's warning." Ed rose a confused brow. "What warning?" Quote. Winry shot him a disbelieving look. "Remember? The one he said about keeping a low profile, and keep your identities hidden?" Quote. The blonde alchemist's confused expression turned somber and serious. "Yeah, I remember. I've been wondering what Mr. Sasuke meant by that, too," Alphonse added, inquisitively. The blonde girl nodded. "I don't know Sasuke's warning means. It's got me worrying that the place you guys are going, it's really dangerous," she clenched her fist. "Just thinking about it makes me scared that something bad would happen to you guys." She bit the inside of her lip, trying to keep her tears at bay. "Just don't die, okay? Promise me that, no matter what, you would come back alive." Quote. Ed and Al just stared at their childhood friend for a good solid minute. Winry waited with bated breath at the brothers' silence, her body almost shaking in anticipation, and her blue eyes wide with anxiety and concern. The train whistled once more and began to take off. It was just then that Ed gave Winry his signature cocky, boyish smile. "We're not going to die that easily, Winry." He shouted at her through the open window as the train disappeared further and further away. "We'll be back before you know it." Quote. The last thing the brothers saw was a small, reassured smile gracing Winry's face. "Boys." Quote. Edward heard his mother's call. Him and his brother were currently playing hide and seek in the front yard. When heard his mother's voice, he perked up with excitement, and dashed towards her as fast as his little feet could carry him. Alphonse emerged from his hiding spot among the bushes and quickly padded across the yard, giggling all the way. However, seeing the somber look on his mother's face, the sadness in Trish's usually cheerfully bright, green eyes caused Ed's huge grin to fade and be replaced with the expression of worry. "Mom, what's wrong?" Ed asked, fearing that his mother might be sick or something. Mom?" Al called out, just as worried as his brother. Trisha did her best to hold back the sadness she was feeling deep within, keeping the sense of dread she felt at bay. Her lips curled up into her usual sweet smile. Her husband may have left, but seeing the smiling faces of her children always made her happy. Although, at this moment, she wasn't as happy as she perceived to be. She had to pretend to be untroubled for her boys. Act like nothing was wrong. She was just going on a little trip with their sister, is all. There's nothing to worry about. Ed, Al. She crouched down to their level, eyeing them carefully as her boys watched her with attentive ears. "I want you to start packing your things. You are staying over at Winry's for a couple of weeks." Edward was the first to speak, a look of confusion displayed on his chubby facial features. "We are staying over at Winry's? What? Why?" Quote. Alphonse tilted his head, quizzically. "Mom, are you going away somewhere?" Quote. "Yes, sweetie. I'm going on a trip and your sister's coming with," she replied, doing her best to choke back her fears. "A trip? A vacation? Why can't we come, too?" Ed pouted, crossing his arms. Trisha tensed, her smile tightened a bit. It was a good thing that Ed and Al didn't notice her uneasiness. They were so innocent. So ignorant and oblivious to the harshness of the world around. They were only 5 and 4, after all. She just wished they would keep their childlike innocence for as long as possible. Sadly, Trisha shook her head. "This is an important business trip, Ed," she answered, softly. She placed a gentle hand on her eldest son's head. "I need you to be a good boy for the Rockbells, and look after your little brother for me while your sister and I are away. Can you do that for me, my little man?" Quote. Ed nodded his head, furiously, proudly puffing out his chest. "I'll look after Al. I promise, Mom," he declared with a childishly determined expression on his face. "Are you going to bring us back some souvenirs, Mom?" Al asked, excitedly. Trisha resisted the urge to frown. Being reminded of this trip, of the inevitable, nearly always broke her heart. But she had to be brave. For her children. "I'll bring something nice for you. The both of you," she finally replied, sweetly, gently ruffling her sons' heads. "Now, go start packing, you two." "Okay." Ed and Al cheered, simultaneously, rushing inside the house, giggling all the way. Once her sons were out of sight, the brown-haired woman took this time to let the few strayed tears she was holding back to slowly glide down her face. "Do you mind look after my boys while their sister and I are away on a trip, Sarah?" Trisha asked the blonde woman. The 4 adults sat around the dining table. A mug of coffee was placed before each of them. The children were out in the backyard, playing while the adults held a serious conversation. The atmosphere was tense and restless. Trisha's tentative hands gripped her mug. Her fingers lightly tapped against the mug. The only one indication of the anxiety she was feeling. "You want us to look after Ed and Al?" Sarah inquired. "We'll be happy to, Trisha. But what about Naruko?" Quote. Trisha nodded her head, slowly taking a sip of her coffee. "I'm taking her with me on a trip," she answered tentatively. The Rockbells frowned. They knew that Trisha went on these little trips with Naruko on several occasions ever since the young girl was adopted into the Elric family. A sense of uneasiness and dread always overtook the brown-haired woman whenever it was time to resemble with young Naruto. They had no clue where the woman left, but they noted that every time she was preparing to leave or came back from her trips, she always appeared extremely stressed and sad. They have tried talking to her about it, trying to help ease her pain, but the woman was stubborn. She wouldn't budge one bit. She would simply tell them there was nothing to worry about, and be on her way. "Trisha, is it alright not to bring Ed and Al?" Hanako questioned, worriedly. The elderly woman blew out a small puff of smoke from her pipe. Trisha merely breathed out a dejected sigh. She knew this would be a long and disheartening conversation. But just like all the other times, she was prepared for it. "If you tell anybody about what we've discussed, there will be consequences." The woman of 3 kids bit the inside of her lip. A small shiver of dismay and depression slithered down her spine as she recalled the malicious threat. She wasn't allowed to speak about her vacations to anybody. Though, admittedly, even she doesn't understand the full reasoning behind why the elders of Naruto's village want to keep a constant update on her daughter on a regular basis. What was so important that they couldn't just leave her daughter, her family alone? Just let them live in resemble in peace. Why do they need to keep tabs on her? As if this was all some sort of environmental experiment to them? A nature versus nurture project? She tried to keep her tears at bay. She had to be strong. For her little girl. Naruto was already distraught enough as is. Naruto enjoyed these trips far less than she did. Though she tries to hide it from her younger brothers, she's always scared and desolate when they have to go back and visit her homeland. As her mother, Trisha had to be confident, supportive, and strong. She had to be someone her little girl could lean on for support. As Naruto's mother, she had to protect her baby girl. Naruto sat under the shade of a tall tree, a sullen expression on her face. Soon, very soon, she would be leaving with her mom back to her hometown, her birthplace, and she was dreading it. "Sister." Quote. The blonde girl jerked her head at the sound of her youngest brother's call. She witnessed as her 2 adorable baby brothers tumbled to her spot in a cutesy manner with each energetic bounce in their steps. "Sister, why aren't you playing with us?" Alphonse asked, his lips forming into a small pout. Naruto shot Al a wry grin. "Sorry, Al. I guess I'm just a little tired." Her 2 brothers shot each other a contemplative look before nodding in understanding. They took a seat on either side of her. Ed on her right and Al on her left. It was relatively quiet between the 3 siblings. They leaned back against the tree silently as they eyed Winry gleefully picking up flowers, giggling to herself all the while. "Sister?" Al spoke, a hint of worry in his tone. "Are you tired? Sad?" Quote. Naruto's eyes grew wide at her youngest brother's concern. "No, Al," she pressed. "What makes you say that?" Quote. The little boy kicked his leg out, apprehensively. "You've been wearing a gloomy face lately," he explained, somberly, mimicking her sullen expression. She shot him a wry smile. She wrapped an arm around his shoulder and pulled him in. "Sorry to make you worry, Al. I'm just thinking about how much I'm going to miss you guys while I'm away." "You and Mom always go away somewhere," Edward pouted. "Why? Where do you go? Why can't we come, too?" Quote. "Don't pout, Ed," Naruto reprimanded him, promptly ignoring his inquiries. "I'll be back before you know it, Dat Bayo." She couldn't tell him where she was going anyway. She wasn't allowed. It was secret, a super secret, apparently. She would be in trouble if she did. Ed whined, not satisfied with her half-baked response. He scooted closer to her. He wanted as much contact with his big sister as he could possibly get. As if he was trying to soak as much of his sister's affection as he possibly and store it like a wet sponge. Naruko felt Ed's head pressed against her right shoulder, and her lips split into a small, gentle smile. She softly patted Al's head as he laid on her lap. She loved her brothers dearly. She would do anything to protect them. She was touched that her brothers were trying to comfort her when her heart was being filled with anticipation and anxiety upon the upcoming trip. The eldest Elric leaned her head back against the tree and sighed in bliss, enjoying the peace and tranquility, the warmth and comfort of her adoring younger brothers as long as she possibly could. "Sister?" Edward spoke, leaning away from her and grabbing her attention. He gazed at her with resolute, golden eyes, a hint of a deep fondness shining behind them. He closed his mouth, a thin line forming as he looked away from his sister's curious stare. His cheeks tinted a light pink out of embarrassment. His fingers idly played with the turf of grass on the ground. "What is it, Ed?" Naruko asked, curiously when he kept shyly silent. He fidgeted, shifting nervously from side to side. Getting a grip on himself and his face steeled in determination, the young blonde crawled away from his confused sister. "Ed, where are you going?" Quote. Ed promptly ignored her query. He called his younger brother over. "Al, come over here." Al lifted his head from Naruko's lap and glanced at his brother. His brows furrowed in confusion. He took him a few seconds of contemplation before he complied with Ed's request. "What is it, brother?" Quote. "Just come over here," Ed urged, hurriedly, straightening up on his knees. "Naruko, you stay there," he shouted. The eldest of the siblings cocked her head, blue eyes glazed with curiosity. "Why?" Quote. Ed's cheeks darkened, feeling flustered. "Jay, just stay," he huffed. "Close your eyes, too. And turn around." Quote. Naruko quirked an amused brow. It was amusing to see how flustered her dear, little brother was coming. Whatever it is he had in mind, he was embarrassed, and when he was embarrassed, he would become extra bossy and endearingly apprehensive because he was just too stubborn and flustered to admit his feelings. She decided to humor him and do what she was told. She twisted her body around. She crossed her arms in front of her eyes and leaned her forehead against the bark of the tree to make sure her vision was completely obscured. She heard make Ed noise out of satisfaction. Her strained ears could hear her brother's hush whispers. Whatever they were conversing about made Alphonse giggle with excitement. Winry seemed to have caught and joined the boys. She could hear the grass crunching under her small footsteps. "What are guys doing?" Winry squeaked, curiously. "A circle? Why are you drawing a circle on the ground, Ed?" Quote. Naruko's ears perked up at that. "A circle? Sheesh." Ed hushed the little girl, harshly. "Geez. Can't you keep quiet? You'll ruin everything." Quote. Winry let out a screeching wail. "Edward, you jerk." Quote. Hearing Winry's sobs, Naruko's instincts kicked out. She always the oldest of the four of them, and felt that it was her need to be the responsible one and take care of the younger ones. Winry had a very sensitive nature, and cries easily from the slightest slight. She turned, so she could defuse the upcoming fight between her brother and their friend. However, before she could make a move to get up, Al stopped her. "Sister. Don't look," he shouted, frantically. "You shouldn't turn around just yet." Quote. Naruto sighed in exasperation. "I had to go and break up the fight between Ed and Winry." "No," he bellowed out, forcibly before quickly covering his mouth out of embarrassment. "I mean, no, sister. Let me handle it. I can calm brother down." She cocked an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Quote. Al nodded his head, furiously whilst nervously chewing on his bottom. Blue eyes just stared at the young boy, silently, scrutinizing his every move and trying to decipher what was going on inside that head of his behind his pinkened face. A small, glint of smile etched across the older girl's face. "Then can I count you to keep your brother in line? If you do that, then I promise not to turn around until you tell me to." He beamed. "Yep," he chirped, happily. Naruto grinned at her youngest brother, and resumed closing her eyes. She heard a breath of relief leave her brother's lips. His feet enthusiastically skipped away as he let out a triumphant, "All clear." "Phew. That was close," Edward breathed out, his shoulders relaxing a bit, a hand pressed against his anxiously pounding heart. The blonde girl smiled against the skin of her arms, laughing lightly to herself when she heard Ed and Winry bickering, and Al trying desperately to break them apart, or else the fighting might cause her to intervene. Naruto did her best to piece together what was so secretive that she wasn't allowed to see. Why were they so adamant about her not seeing what they were doing behind her back? Then she gasped. Were they planning to surprise her? A wave of giddiness, excitement, and suspense struck her. What kind of surprise were her brothers preparing for her? Where were they going to get it? Now that she thought about it, didn't Winry mention something about Ed drawing a circle in the dirt? Her mind tried to process what could a circle in the dirt meant. Unless... Was Ed planning to use alchemy? Was he going to make something for her using alchemy? Ever since their father left, Edward and Alphonse had been immersed in his alchemic books and theories. She tried to read them herself a couple of times, but they were too hard. They were way too sciencey for her taste. She couldn't, for the life of her, make heads or tails or what was written. Heck, it caused her brain so much agony just trying to read the first paragraph. Which made her even more proud of her dear brothers that they could read, decipher, and understand such difficult text. Was she jealous? Of course not. She'd always known that wasn't the brainy type. Why would she be jealous over something like that? She would rather play and run around outside than sit in an empty room and study books all day. Though, Naruto had never seen Ed and Al perform alchemy before. They have done alchemy before. At least, not in front of her as far as she could recall. Well, except that one time they made a wooden bird from the floorboard in order to impress Mom. And ever since, they've been immersed in the world of alchemy. She remembered being in awe at seeing the flash of blue light emerged. To her, it was like a magic trick. So mysterious and majestic. She was so mesmerized by such a fantastic display of something so utterly cool that begged her younger brothers to teach her. Unfortunately, she didn't have the knack for it, and after 3 weeks, she gave up. Though, she had never seen her brothers perform alchemy since then, and that was months ago. She was so happy and proud to have a couple of prodigious brothers. Although, she was a little wary. Not of her brothers. Of course not. She was wary of what their natural talent in alchemy could mean for them. The thought of not being to protect Ed and Al terrified her. She's their big sister. She should be able to take care of them and keep them safe, no matter what. The blonde girl would often fear of the greedy adults that would try to take advantage of their exceptional skills in alchemy. She doesn't know where this extra bout of wariness came from. She learned that she was more alert and guarded than most kids her age. Maybe it had something to do with her horrid time in the orphanage, enduring those cold glares, silently telling her, cursing her to go die already. Or maybe it was something instinctively ingrained in her from birth. Who knows? Or is just natural instincts that comes from being a big sister to two little brothers. Sister. Quote. Naruko's ears perked up from the sound of Alphonse's excited call, and she snapped out of her musings. However, she didn't dare turn around yet. Sister, turn around. Quote. Naruko, you can look now. Quote. The enthusiasm in brother's tones made Naruko's heart leap with giddy anticipation. She couldn't wait to see the surprise that awaited her. Bouncing onto her feet, the eldest girl made a swift turn around to catch a view of her younger brothers staring at her with bright, wide grins, though Alphonse's was a little more bashful than Edward's. We made you a present. Edward outstretched his hands to reveal a beautifully created tiny, metal, winged horse. The design was so simple yet elegant. The small details were carefully crafted into an intricate design. The horse was prettied up with a bunch of different styles and patterns. The wings, especially, were wonderfully majestic. The attractive features caught her blue eyes the most. Although, the horse still had that childlike vibe to it overall. Did you guys make this for me? Naruko asked, stunned and wide-eyed and astonished. You bet. Ed chirped, proudly, a bit of his arrogance seeping in his tone. Do you like it, sister? Al asked, a bit shyer than his proud brother. Like it? I love it. Naruko beamed, ecstatically. Truthfully, her happiness was derived from the fact that her brothers made her the gift, rather than the gift itself. This was genuinely the first present she had received from her brothers. She couldn't stop the overwhelming flow of emotions that swirled inside her heart. It was times like these that reminded her how much she was loved by the Elric family, giving her another reason to remember that she was family, even if she is adopted. Her heart was overflowing with happiness right now. Naruko, on impulse, pulled her two younger brothers into a passionate hug, and peppered their cheeks with light kisses. She could pick up the sound of Edward's embarrassed whines, but she didn't care. She was extremely giddy with delight and exhilaration. He just had to endure her elated displays of affection. Ew. Ed complained in disgust, trying fruitlessly to squirm out of her strong grip. Sister, stop kissing us. It's embarrassing. Quote. Al just giggled with glee, happy that his older sister enjoyed her present so much. Winry smiled sweetly at the group hug between the Elric siblings. I'm the one who suggested they put wings on the horse. She piped in. Naruko sent the younger girl an appreciative grin, and pulled her into a hug. You did? Thanks, Winry. You're so sweet. Quote. The smaller girl blushed, feeling flustered and happy from receiving a hug from her big sister figure. "Naruko, it's time to go." Quote. The piercing and sullen sound of the Elric's matriarch call disheartened the mood a bit. Naruko could feel her heart almost break at the distressing and saddening looks Ed and Al were shooting her. Winry's suppressed tears and quivering lips wasn't help matters either. "Well, this is goodbye," she spoke in a somewhat bittersweet tone. "Ed, Al, you guys take care of yourselves while Mom and I are gone." Her youngest brother instantly wrapped his tiny arms around her waist in a tearful embrace. "Come back soon, sister," he sniffled. Ed tugged on her sleeve, eyeing his big sister with such a solemn expression. "Take care, sister," he said, trying to keep the sadness he was feeling inside at bay. "You and Mom stay safe. We'll be waiting with Auntie, Uncle, and Winry." Unlike her brother's sad expressions, Winry decided to send Naruko off with a bright smile. Even though a few streaks of tears were gliding down her face. "Have fun, Naruko. Bring us back lots of toys and gifts," she cried, cheerily and a slightly gloomy. Once again, the eldest girl felt her heart clench at the dispirited appearance on her brothers' and friends' countenances. She pulled the three into one last, woeful hug. Trisha paced, mechanically into the backyard with a dour expression on her face. When her kids having a group hug, she smiled, melancholically. Seeing this touching scene before her, drew a small pain in her heart. Tears pricked at the corner of her eyes. She wondered how long their peaceful lives would be able to last. Would Naruko be able to stay with them forever? The Ishvalan civil war have already started. And because of the war, Naruko living with them had been deemed unsafe. They were getting anxious, restless, furious even, demanding for her return to her rightful birthplace. Though she wouldn't dare part with her. She was her daughter. Ed's and Al's big sister. If she left, it would surely break the boys' hearts. They were still recovering from their father's absence. They couldn't take any more distressing and heart-wrenching news. It would practically destroy them. Especially Al. He was only 4. All Trisha could do was smile and pray with every fiber of her being that nothing else would rip their family apart. Make it even more broken than it already is. With that fake sweet smile still plastered on her face, used to hide her anxiety and anguish, she called her baby girl over. "Naruko, it's time go, sweetie." Her hands lightly shook as she gripped the handle of their suitcase tightly. Naruko released her younger brothers and friend. She shot them one last longing look before nodding her head, solemnly. Okay. Mother and daughter both fully understood this trip would be dreadful. They just didn't know how disastrous it would be. No. This couldn't be happening. Her green eyes were wide with horror. Her entire body was paralyzed with crippling dread and unspeakable terror. Her forehead was dripping with sweat. Her hands trembling at her sides. Her heart was clenched so tightly, her chest hurt. Her breathing became more labored as time clicked away. And no. You can't. She's my baby girl. She cried, hysterically. All her agonizing emotions being released at once. She's my daughter. A sense of overwhelming despair hit her like a violent tornado. "She's not your daughter," was the icy cold response she received. The elder stared at her with his wintry, dark eyes. His single, unbandaged eye that showed nothing but in. "Naruko belongs to us. She belongs to Konoha. You will bring her back." Danzo, that's enough. The man wearing a red irately reprimanded the other guy by the name of Danzo, sending him a harsh glare. His tone was flavored with displeasure and disgust towards the man. Sometimes his old friend could be way too heartless and cruel. Couldn't he see that the poor woman was on the brink of despair? The third Hokage shot Trisha a sad and sympathetic gaze. Forgive him for his harsh and insensitive words, Mrs. Elric. There was a tense, suffocating silence. They hung around the room. Hiruzen honestly doesn't know what to say. It was true that it was time for Naruko to begin her training as a shinobi of the leaf. It's primitive because of what the young girl carries inside her. The nine-tailed fox. The girl needs training to learn how to control the fox's power. But this woman, she was the one who raised Naruko for the past 4 years. The one who showered the poor, lonely, orphaned girl with love and affection. The person who showed her what a mother's warmth feels like. The who took care of her, sheltered her, nurtured her. The person the girl had fondly grew to call Mom. This painful decision would tragically rip the unfortunate family apart. If the Hokage remembered correctly, the woman also had 2 biological sons. Naruko's adopted brothers. As per the contract, he could imagine that Trisha kept her end of the bargain, and they have been ignorant of this whole ordeal for the past few years. There was only one solution. It is unfortunate, Mrs. Elric, but we do need Naruko to return to Konoha. It is of utmost importance. With the Ishvalan civil war, some of us don't think the girl is safe in Amestris, the Hokage said, forlornly. The other members of the council nodded in agreement. But I have an idea that I think may suffice. How about moving your family to the village hidden in the leaves along with Naruko? Quote, Lord Hokage. The baffled and outraged voices of the other elders in the room rang out. However, Hiruzen wasn't interested in what they had to say. Trying to rip Naruko apart from her family was beyond cruel and unnecessary. Trisha's green eyes lit, a bit of hope shining behind her teary-eyed, emerald orbs. Ultimately, she could either choose to let Naruko go, and stay with her in Konoha along with Ed and Al. She completely understood that both decisions would drastically affect her family. This was a choice that would drastically alter their way of life. She couldn't afford to make a mistake.
Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night. See you next time, my dear faves.